welcome everyone to this, the Justice Committee's third meeting of 2013. Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely as they interfere with broadcasting, even when switched to silent. Item 1, decision on taking business in private. Does the committee agree to take items 6 and 7 in private? Agreed. Thank you very much. Item 2, subordinate legislation. It's consideration of an affirmative instrument, the Draft Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974, Exclusions and Exceptions, Scotland Order 2013. I welcome Kenny McCaskill, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, who is here to give evidence on the instrument and move the motion for the committee to approve it. It's accompanied by Scottish Government officials Nigel Graham and Craig McGuffey. I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement if he wishes.
Thank you. The purpose of this draft order is to consolidate the current exclusion and exceptions order made in 2003. This is because there have been 16 modifying orders since 2003, and we think it's correct to consolidate all the modifying orders into one fresh order. This will help make the legislation easier to use. It is important to stress that nothing in this order, or indeed the Act itself, debars any person from undertaking any job or profession. However, it does help inform decisions that may be made about whether to employ specific persons in specific areas of employment. We believe it's appropriate that positions involving a particular level of trust, such as work in the childcare and health professions, should be exempt from the provisions of the Act to ensure there's adequate protection for children and vulnerable people in particular. It is important that we strike the right balance between supporting the rehabilitation of offenders and protecting the public. Employment can reduce reoffending, thereby cutting the cost of crime and helping close the opportunity gap. Along with consolidating the order, we're taking this opportunity to make some minor changes to the content of the order, including removing outdated references to independent schools tribunals following separate legislative changes made back in 2005, updating of references relating to appeal procedures under the Lottery etc. Act 1993, widening conviction information available to the Financial Services Authority when authorising a person to carry out regulated activities, taking account of the commencement of the Electronic Money Directive by the UK Government, providing for a new category of institution called payment institutions created in 2009 by the Payment Services Directive implemented by the UK Government, permitting approved regulators under the Legal Services Scotland Act 2010 to consider spent convictions where appropriate as part of their assessment of the fitness of investors and those in certain named positions within licensed providers, ensuring the court is able to have access to information relating to the spent convictions of anyone who's seeking to become a lay representative within the meaning of the Legal Services Scotland Act 2010, making consequential changes required by police reform, making consequential changes reflecting summary justice reform legislation and the role of signing justices of the peace, and altering the definition of actuary to reflect the merger of the Faculty of Actuaries and the Institute of Actuaries. Overall, we consider these amendments are necessary to ensure that various agencies and bodies are able to continue to fulfil their functions effectively. That's a quick run-through of what is a lengthy instrument, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Rod, and then Jenny, and then Graham.
Morning, Cabinet Secretary panel. I just appreciate a little bit of clarification as to, in the legal services situation, the approved regulators consider spent convictions where appropriate. What is meant by where appropriate in this context?
Are you able to clarify that, Nigel?
Yes, well, it's to check to make sure that there's, I suppose it's protecting the appropriate investments. So where appropriate, they have to make the checks. It's exactly the same way as dealing with solicitors and advocates in order to actually see whether they're fit and proper to actually do that. So I can't say what would be appropriate. They have to actually determine what would be appropriate in order to make that decision. But it's about protecting the public and making sure that investors are appropriate people to do that.
You've just said it's not appropriate to say what's appropriate, but I may have missed that.
It's really a matter for the Law Society of Scotland to decide what
yes,
their criteria should be.
Yes. So you happy with that, Rod?
I'm not sure I'm any clearer, but
I'm sure I'm not any clearer, so that's a step ahead of you.
I'm happy to leave it there.
Jenny.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you said in your opening remarks that a primary concern with this was to protect children and and vulnerable people, which I completely agree with and understand regarding the disclosure of spent convictions. However, I think the majority of cases that are outlined in the Scottish Government paper don't deal with children or vulnerable people. There are several amendments to financial services, to legal services. I was unclear about the changes to independent schools tribunals and national lottery. Maybe you can explain those for us. Also, lay representatives on the Court of Session Rules Council. I'm not sure how that directly impacts children. It's not as if you're making these decisions for people working in social services or schools. So I think there's quite a big civil liberties issue here as well, because there is an extension of the disclosure of convictions. And I wondered on that basis why the Scottish Government has decided not to do a full consultation, given that there is a civil liberties issue here. I think I would be more comfortable if these extensions were being made after a consultation.
Well, I think there's two separate matters. First of all, things such as independent schools, all these matters. There have been changes, as I've said, since 2003. There's been 16 changes. This is an attempt to try and provide some consolidation. These changes have happened. They've been put in through previous SSIs, either by myself or by my predecessors. So these changes are ongoing. Society, as we know it, some of the organisations here have changed. In terms of lay advisors, they're being brought in and we have to make arrangements for them. So that's the situation there. This is meant to provide some clarification to make sure that law is as clear as it can be at the moment. The wider issue you raise is about a broader matter about going into consultation, which we are intent on doing in the coming months, and we will be going out to consultation on where rehabilitation of offenders and matters of, which are, I think, a matter of balance should lie. So as I say, this is about getting the law as fit for purpose as it can be, given the significant changes, 16 in 9 years, that I think make it easier. But we are not taking away from the fact that you're quite correct. There is a broader issue here that has to be looked at, and we will be going out to consultation over the coming months.
So there will be a consultation before Parliament finally signs this off?
No, Parliament is being asked to sign off this statutory instrument to make the law as clear as it can be at the present moment, to deal with matters that have changed, to provide for matters that have come in, to make sure that it is, as I said, easier for those who are operating in it. But equally, we do recognise that there are more fundamental principles about the rehabilitation of offenders, and we're going out to consult on that in coming months.
Why did the Scottish Government not undertake full consultation, given the broad extensions that are raised here?
Well, I think what this provides is an opportunity to get the law tidied up. There are matters where there's been historical changes because the Institute of Actuaries and the Faculty of Actuaries have become one. These, as I say, have been matters that have been dealt with by SSIs over some 16 SSIs over a period of 9 years. So we're seeking to tidy the law up here to address matters such as would be wanted by the Lord President, to be look at lay advisors that are coming in. Equally, we recognise that there is a broader issue of public concern about where the balance should lie in the issue of rehabilitation of offenders, and on that we will be going out to consultation. It would be possible to leave this morass, but it seems to us that we have been asked by many stakeholders to try and provide some element of clarity, to sort out matters, some of which, as I say, are quite innocuous, but doubtless have effects in terms of the nomenclature and amalgamation and actuaries. So it's about getting that right, but it doesn't undermine or take away or detract from the fact that there will be a full consultation meant to, I think, provide a public debate on where the balance should lie.
I just want to clarify for myself the process that the committee can agree. If the committee recommends this today, it goes to Parliament, and if they vote for the affirmative instrument, where does this consultation fit in? Is this a wider consultation on rehabilitation?
Absolutely, that is a much wider...
I see, yeah. I appreciate it. So it's not with regard to this particular instrument.
No,
just to clarify that. Thank you. Graham.
Pete, I think you probably have a copy of the paper that was provided to us. Section 19, persons appointed to assist the police. It indicates the fact that the 1967 Police Scotland Act falls, and that we're now subject to Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012. indicates at the bottom of that paragraph that Section 26 of the 2012 Act is framed in a slightly different way from how Section 9 of the 1967 Act presumably was framed, and there are consequential changes. Could you explain in what way was it framed slightly differently?
Well, the consequential changes being made to paragraph 6 and 8 of Part 2 of Schedule 4 of this order is to reflect the forthcoming repeal of Section 9 of the Police Scotland Act 1967. And overall, the policy of these paragraphs in this order remains the same as the equivalent paragraph in the 2003 order. So it's to reflect changes in other legislation to make sure that we keep matters ongoing.
No, but the question was, it indicates further up in that paragraph that Section 26 of the 2012 Act is framed in a slightly different way from how Section 9 of the 67 Act was framed. And I wondered if anybody could explain in what way was it different and why was it framed that way?
I don't think we're able to give a precise answer to that, but we're happy to write in greater detail.
Obliged.
Thank you. And John?
Cabinet Secretary, I too am very interested in civil liberties, but I consider these proposals proportionate with regard to not only the people directly involved, but indirectly. I note in the document we have here that there has been, under the heading consultation, there's been detailed discussions with relevant bodies. Have any of these bodies expressed reservations about the proposals?
No, I spent last year speaking to stakeholders around the whole issue of Rehabilitation Offenders Act. All the stakeholders I've spoken to, Apex Scotland, SACRO, are happy with the balance of reform, putting offending behaviour behind, but also protecting the public. So in terms of the Rehabilitation Offenders Act order, all were happy with the principal purposes of what's there, and also the scrutiny that you have to go through with a statutory instrument of this nature, which goes through committee and Parliament. So nobody has indicated anything to me to suggest that there are concerns about what's currently in there.
Thanks very much indeed.
Not actually pertaining to this order, but following on from your comments, Cabinet Secretary, on this consultation on rehabilitation of offenders, do I take it you're looking at some primary legislation on rehabilitation of offenders? It's on the agenda at some point.
That would be required. So this consultation is prelude to the consideration of primary legislation.
Can I ask when, if you maybe not be able to, but you know the committee is looking into purposeful activity in prisons, and obviously we're interested in how that helps towards rehabilitation of offenders. So it would be helpful if you give the committee some idea perhaps of any timetable for this forthcoming legislation.
That would ultimately be for the Minister for Parliamentary Business, but it'd be fair to say it's at the end of the tenure of this Parliament. At the end, right. So that gives us an opportunity to put forward our ideas, I think, following on our inquiry. That's what I wanted to pursue. To go out to consultation by the summer. Clearly that consultation will have to take place for a period of time. So I think, you know, that then takes you into 2014. So you're not looking at a legislative vehicle until near the end of the parliamentary term. It's a matter for the committee, but maybe the committee itself would collectively want to have a report which might respond to, depending on what that consultation says, because then it puts us straight into the statutory process as well as into our own inquiry. I think that would be very useful. I'd like to move on now to item 3, consideration of the draft order. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion for us to approve the instrument. Formally moved. Now, does anyone wish to debate this now?
Can I
Yes, certainly,
just
of course.
say briefly, I mean, I don't feel, convener, that I can support waving through an extension to disclosure of spent convictions without a full consultation. It seems to me that there are, as I laid out before, there are far too many extensions contained to be waved through in a statutory instrument without proper consultation, and for that reason I can't support it.
But you, yes, no, you. It's a debate, so certainly.
I would be grateful if Jenny Mara could just outline where she thinks these extensions are, other than technical changes. It's
not usual for committee members to ask each other questions. It's usually the Cabinet Secretary, but perhaps the Cabinet Secretary would answer that question. Or I mean, well, we're in the debate period now, actually, so it has to be the Cabinet Secretary.
They're not.
And extensions of changes have occurred, such as in the Faculty of Actuaries, changes have occurred in terms of how independent schools are regulated, changes have occurred in the National Lottery, changes have occurred in the Police Scotland Act as we repeal the 67 Act. So these things are not about an extension as such, it's about clarification to the terrain that has changed under our feet to make the law clearer for those who are all involved in this. There will be a further debate. We will be delighted to engage with the committee and we'd welcome the committee's views as we, as a society and parliament, seek to set where the balance is. This is simply about trying to get matters up to speed and to take into account lay representatives that we've brought in, where the court will also have to make sure that these are people who are appropriate, and where, if they are to appear in the court on behalf of individuals, then some information should be available to the judiciary to be aware of just who they are allowing before them.
I'll ask Jenny Mara to actually, Cabinet Secretary, can you perhaps point exactly the bit you mean? That's...
Yeah, I mean, even a cursory look at the paper, Cabinet Secretary, Financial Services Authority, we are also extending the current exception to a new category of institution. And as I pointed out earlier, the Financial Services Authority is not a body that has a direct impact on children and vulnerable people, as you initially explained. So it seems to me an extension to the disclosure of spent convictions that don't seem to match your original aim to protect children and vulnerable people. And as I say, there is a civil liberties issue here when you're extending this disclosure.
Well, I do think it's about protecting vulnerable people. I think we're aware of... well, actually, yes, many people can be the victim of great frauds that are perpetrated by people, especially upon the vulnerable, especially upon the elderly and those with dementia. It's a matter that's frequently raised with me by senior police officers, and I've no doubt Mr Pearson would have experience of it, of organised groups who operate in this. The circumstances here have come about because we do have legislation that applies south of the border, because changes have occurred in terms of financial services. What we want to do is to make sure that the law that provides protection for vulnerable people, including the elderly and indeed ordinary Scots who sometimes can be dealt with and have to deal with financial services, to make sure that as much information is available as possible to those who are charged with the responsibility that goes with being licensed under the Financial Services Authority. So we think this is an appropriate step to make sure that we get the law up to speed. Changes have taken place in financial services that have not been reflected in the rehabilitation of offenders. If we don't bring this through, then people will not require to disclose matters that would be required to disclose south of the border, and areas of Scottish society could be threatened or jeopardised where protection is offered south of the border. We haven't been in charge of the timetable of bringing in matters for the FSA, etc., but it is our obligation, I think, in terms of making sure that we provide protection to the public, to make sure that we get the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act up to speed.
But you will accept that there is an extension here and it's not simply retrospective?
Yes, and it's done for the right reasons, to provide protection, to make sure that those who are given the right to operate in the financial services world actually meet the criteria, and that those who regulate them are aware of who is seeking employment within them.
I mean, that was my point, that there shouldn't be an extension without consultation, so thank you.
Graham.
Just for clarity in terms of what you're proposing, is it your position that at some future date within the life of this Parliament that the wider issues pertaining to the balance between human rights, individual human rights and civil liberties will be analysed in the context of these provisions, disclosure, so that the appropriate balance can be achieved and discussed more fully across the Parliament?
Yes, that's what will be contained as one part of the consultation and document, is a widespread review.
I mean, I do accept the point that you make that those who would seek employment within financial services do gain access to, particularly the elderly, who are vulnerable and perhaps not as adept at making judgments about who to trust as others. And it would not be acceptable that people who had a criminal background, in whatever way one would describe that, would be able to seek employment and thereby be seen to be authorised to conduct and transact that kind of business. So I do see the threat that you identify there. But I think the points that Jenny Mara makes about the appropriate balance being achieved after consultation and discussion is an important one. I would be concerned if the point that you're making is that in the interim, vulnerable sections of our community will be left vulnerable as we await this next debate. Is that your current position?
The point I'm making.
Point. Do you still want to come in, Rod? I thought
Just a small point in relation to paragraph 10, the payment institutions point. It says the equivalent of the 2003 order in England and Wales has been amended to address this issue. Can anyone advise whether or not that went to consultation in England? Or is it just amended?
We're not able to say.
Yeah.
I think that once had a good battering, as they might say, that point. So I now move on to put the question. Is that motion S4M 5457 be agreed to? Are we agreed?
No. No.
We're not agreed. There will therefore be a division. Those in favour, please show. Those against, please show. 742 against, there were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and for attending with your officials, and I suspend the meeting briefly, but we're not leaving our seats. Agenda. It's to report back on our prison visits between us. We visited Barlinnie, Edinburgh, Inverness, Lowmorse, Perth and Polmont over the last 2 weeks. Alison McInnes and myself are going to Adwell tomorrow morning. You've seen the detailed written report backs that have been provided with the papers as item, but I think it might be helpful, especially given our next agenda item, if we just went round the table and, keyword here please, highlighted. Don't go through the whole paper, just to put, spot out the things that are the most important. And I also want to apologise to Roderick Campbell, which your name has been put incorrectly in the front of the paper. That must have made you cry. The other thing I'd like to say is that we're going to have in the next item Colin McConnell, Chief Executive of the SPS in front of us. I know that Colin is in the public area just now, so bear that in mind when you're highlighting things, because you're already getting a hint of where you're going to be going with your questions. So I'll start at to my right, and I'll start with John Finney, please. You're at Inverness, so if you would just highlight, please, the issues that you'd want to draw attention to.
We're made very welcome. There's a lot of very positive work ongoing there. I think the issue is one of building construction, the limitations of that, and thereafter the capacity for meaningful work to be undertaken. I think there's a note on page 3 about an ongoing project about pathways into offending, and I think we need to follow up on that and keep a keen interest in that. There was a lot of similarity between the reports, so I don't think there's a point in highlighting the various work streams that do exist there. I think limitations around education primarily based around the fact that the chapel's used and whoever the clergy person in charge of the chapel places some limitations on its use. I think a very positive note there's a female offenders unit and 24 prisoners through the unit in the last 3 years and only 3 re-offending. And I think the quality of the fabric of that particular wing might be an indication of, how if you treat folk in a certain way, they maybe respond in another way. And what I thought was significant, ongoing links with the unit. So people who have left occasionally are phoning in for reassurance, advice, someone in very meaningful, gainful employment too. So a lot of positives there, but limitations of the structure of the building, which is right in the centre of the town, creates some difficulties.
Maybe later develop why the women's part is very successful, perhaps in questions. I think that was very interesting. Colin and David, you both went to Saughton, or HMP Prison, Edinburgh, but I call it Saughton, yes. Would you like to say something about that, David and Colin? It's rather like a routine, isn't it? David and Colin, the yes. Colin and Davids, yes.
Well, I think there were limitations in the work programme that the prisoners were involved in. And a lot of that was to do with the fact that there were quite a significant number of relatively short-stay prisoners, so it was harder to, in a sense, get them onto meaningful programmes. So I would say that that was probably the biggest weakness in the schedule. But the other side of the coin was that people, excuse me, there were meaningful activities as well. I mean, it wasn't all just to be dismissed out of hand, but I did get the impression that it wasn't as well structured or organised as it might be.
Colin?
I'd go along with what David says there. It's I think some of the things that we were seeing in terms of work were quite impressive in terms of the portable appliance testing, I should say. Woodworking, all that sort of thing. It's very, very good. But there's fundamental problems, particularly within the short-term prisoner population, where some don't have the inclination to do anything, and it's getting people involved in anything can be quite difficult. Those were the real things. The shortage of, 250 places, I think it was, in activities, does put some degree of pressure on, but the underlying thing, particularly for those on short term, was a very mundane day was being faced, and as I pointed out to you at the end when we had a discussion with two prisoners who were due for release later on in the week, when we were asked about the issues of short-term sentences in terms of deterrent punishment rehabilitation, their answer that came back was that their term in prison was an inconvenience. And I think it's one of these things. So boredom, and I would probably suggest that my view on short-term prison sentences are becoming harder because of visits like this. I don't think they're worth very much, if I'm being honest.
Can I just ask you, you've got something about the internet which has come up. You mentioned that the internet restrictions and the internet was something that you've got in the report that it's successfully done elsewhere in the UK. Do you feel that this is for educational purposes and so on? Did you pursue that at all? Or?
I think from what I remember about the conversation that we had over it, it was where do you allowing internet access for educational purposes is one thing, but is there any access to other things getting out there through the internet? I still have problems, but I see why the educationalists would want a bit more access, and it'd have to be more people or more barriers to having a wider access outside within the internet.
Well, we were at Polmont, Alison. Do you want to say something about that? I'm just going through the paper as it appears.
Yes, it was a very interesting visit, and they made us very welcome, and we had a good time exploring quite a number of things. There are particular challenges, I think, for a young offenders institution. The community is more volatile. They perhaps have more relationship issues that they have to deal with. And being a national institution, it also has difficulties linking back into the local authorities. So there's patchy involvement. Some local authorities are quite actively involved in connecting with the offenders in preparation for release, and others are not. So that's something that needs to be tackled. There were clearly multiple agencies, partners, different people involved in the prison, and while that is on the one hand a good thing, I think there were disconnects between them, and there were different approaches coming through. So there was the kind of youth and community approach that you were getting from Bernardos, for example, who were involved, who were actively trying to encourage offenders to engage with some of the classes and groups that were on, and you had the more traditional college provider who was involved, who tended to just accept that there were, I think she said, a third of the prisoners at any one time just wouldn't be engaged. And I was concerned by that resignation, I suppose. So the things that I would like to explore are how you encourage everyone to be engaged and what activities are available. the new governor there, quite relatively new, a few months into the post, and she's instructed a thorough review of all the activity, and I think that analysis will be quite helpful actually. You know, you'll be able to see what's working, what's not, and perhaps coordinate it better.
I'll just add a couple of bits to that. Again, internet-based learning, I know I accept all the difficulties about that. I agree with you about education, what I call by stealth. Getting people into plumbing and joinery and saying, you know, you measure at a metre, and they don't know what a metre was, so they saw the purpose in learning rather than it being detached from ordinary life. I think one of the things that I also raised this in Parliament on mental health debate is the fact that so many don't have a GP. So all this excellent work goes on in drug and alcohol and mental health issues, and it's all the data's collected, they're treated, and then they're discharged, often on a Saturday. The facilities aren't open, housing's not open. You know, can't expect every prisoner discharged to have somebody meeting them, but somehow not to waste all that effort that the prison officers and the medical team have done in prison. Immediately they're out, they get a wee drop of money and off they go back into their way before. I think the other issue was families and parenting. I think if you'd seen my face and Alison's face, we watched this young man feed his 6-month-old child chocolate, which is, and we said nothing, but he was a nice lad, and she was like, they're a very young couple, a young baby, and you just watched them, and you thought they need a proper family parenting centre so that they get the right training in how to do things. And it was a very short time also he was there. They were lucky she'd travelled from fairly nearby, whereas, as you're quite right, Alison, Pullman's the whole of Scotland, so if it's a couple, 25% of these lads are parents. I nearly dropped when I heard that. So we want to try and do that. So family centre, which we'd heard from Cortonvale, also very important. I think that's just some touchstones on it, through Care as Usual and family centres, to try and break the things. I noticed from your paper from Saughton is that we've got third generational inmates, and you felt that, well, we must stop not just people going through the churn, but the next generation going through the churn. I now go on to the next one is Graham. You were at Low Moss.
Yeah, I attended Low Moss last week. A very modern prison, it'll be a year old next month. 700 prisoners, just about to capacity, nearly 120 remand prisoners. So comments made earlier about the difficulty of engaging with remand prisoners and encouraging them to participate in the prison life and the activity is something of a problem. And with some of the other short-term prisoners who need to be encouraged to see the point. Unusual aspects of the prison, it has very tight external security. They have a very significant number of CCTV cameras, both externally and internally, covering the environment, and they have a complete no metal policy within the prison. And I think the staff and management believe that the culture of the prison can be more relaxed because the external security is such that they have a high level of confidence that the internal nature of the prison is reasonably secure and that contraband is reduced to an absolute minimum. They have a curfew on TV access, so prisoners are put to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning, TV's off, and that seems to have had a very positive effect on the nature of the prison because it encourages them to get a night's sleep, which means in the morning they're more engaged and determined to go out and do something rather than, as I understand, in many other prisons, they're allowed to watch TV throughout the night. And I think all of us know that if that's the case, then you're not in the right frame of mind in the morning to engage. Family visits are a main feature of the prison, and families are encouraged to come in as and when they would wish throughout the week. The arrangements for family visits are within the main hall, which would look to, well, certainly look to me like a gymnasium-type environment. You could play five-a-side football in the big area, but there's no doubt that the prison staff have made it as friendly and as receiving as possible. And apparently it works. We didn't see any families, or I didn't see any families when I was there, but there was no doubt the enthusiasm of the staff, and the area looks fresh and clean and tidy, and indeed Cubs, Scouts, Brownies, Guides are all encouraged to meet within the prison environment, and the children of the prisoners are encouraged to join the local Cubs and Scouts and so forth. And the hope is that they take that with them back to their own locations, their own estates, and that they maintain that kind of community involvement. Prisoners are involved in work within the prison to maintain the prison environment, basic painting, cleaning the windows, stuff like that, which I think is a very good thing. And I think that the Governor would be keen to see external work be part of the process at Low Moss. And there was comment that in the old Low Moss, long time gone, but external work groups did pathways, dealt with vandalism, cleaned up areas around Eastern Bartonshire, and apparently gave a lot of time and effort to the local community. The activity sheet at the front of the report indicates the hours dedicated to each of the activities. By no means do I undermine any of the effort that the staff put into these various activities, but it is very noticeable that offender behaviour programme attendance, merely 6,800 hours, scheduled activity 436,000 hours, other activity, PT and so forth, nearly 52,000 hours. So the 6,800 for the reoffending kind of pales into some insignificance there. And the same with education. It's certainly 21,500 hours dedicated to education, but given the information that we've received over the last couple of years about what's important, education certainly needs a bit more effort, and the same with the offender behaviour programme. But a very positive visit, and really impressed with the culture of the staff and the management within the prison, who deserve, encouragement.
Can I just ask you, by education attendance, is that like formally sitting down learning to read and write and count, or the kind of thing that I would have included in it, which was applied education, as it were?
I think it's a bit of all sorts.
Okay.
I think there's a softness to it that is merely attending and showing an interest would include in the hours, but there's an encouragement to get practical skills, to know how to measure, paint and build things, which I think is encouraging.
Sandra, you were at Barlinnie, Barrel.
Barrel, yes, which I think that's what they said when we walked in, and it was very, very interesting. And I got a hat and I got a mug, and the clerk also got a mug as well, which you can't buy, so perhaps in later years in Antiques Roadshow, I don't know, this mug might appear as an heirloom from someone. I want to thank Joanne for all the notes she took, and it was very interesting. I was very impressed, by the Governor's dedication and the staff also, and they were very honest with us. Very honest with the prisoners also. We had a tour around most of the prison. We met numerous prisoners in numerous areas who were very upfront and honest with us also, never led by the Governor to answer questions or what questions they could actually ask. It was a very, very relaxed atmosphere in some of the areas. I think some of the problems, I think, is exactly the same as been raised by others as well. Lack of housing employment opportunities on release, particularly for short-term sentences and also for remand prisoners. One of the interesting issues that arose from the remand prisoners not participating in programmes or courses is that the Governor said that they were often advised by their lawyers not to take part in this, any programmes or courses, as it could be seen as an admission of guilt, which I thought was a very interesting, comment made by the Governor. Basically, as I said, we saw Theatre Nemo. There was also a play being put on by an American actress also, which was 55 prisoners attended that play. We went in near the end and we spoke to a number of the prisoners there, and they certainly seemed to get a lot out of it. It was about someone who'd been incarcerated in Auschwitz, so it was called Imprisonment. We spoke to the actress and also, as I say, the prisoners, And one prisoner came up and said it was even better than going to the Oran Moor for a play, a pie and a pint. He thought it was a much better performance in that respect. As I say, I was very impressed by the amount that was going on. One of the issues that came up, a number of issues, was basically the through care opportunities for, as I said, short-term prisoners also. And when we spoke to a number of the prisoners, one gentleman said that he'd been revolving door for 20 years, and he wasn't that old. But basically, when he was out of prison, the shortage of housing, he was given a sleeping bag at some, some areas, and obviously were put into hostel, so therefore got back into the same old ways again. So I think it's something that was really raised in regarding that. We were also told that literacy and numeracy levels were not as poor as portrayed, because they were giving a 5-page booklet to fill in, and 90% of the prisoners were able to fill that in, so therefore assumed that they could read what they were actually filling in and answering as well. One of the other interesting issues that came up when we were talking about employment and housing as well was that they felt there was too many agencies trying to deliver similar programmes, and they weren't all meeting up together. It wasn't through care in regards to that. Just want to mention Low Moss. It was talked about overcrowding, and the Governor had said that until Low Moss came along, it was very, very, as we know, overcrowded. But at the moment, the prison levels are nearer to 1,300, which Barlinnie hosts 1,104, and they've got 560 staff. So I was very impressed with what they tried to do, but the main concerns, I think, are the same as others: short-term prisoners, remand prisoners, where perhaps that's where we should be targeting rather than others, and it didn't seem to be getting through for the reasons that the Governor raised with us.
I mean, I'm conscious, and I did this myself, that we talk about purposeful activity against the whole spectrum of drug and alcohol and education and work and so on, but it does drift into through care, and I suppose in one way it's the purposeful activity within prison. Part of it is that it continues afterwards and isn't just seen at the prison gates. But I'm aware that we're kind of going into that as well. Maybe we just have to. I mean, I'm not criticising it as well. I think it's maybe part of the whole
I think it's something
thing, yeah.
that, I think we should raise, and perhaps as we're going on in the quarry, that's some of the things that we should be raised. But one of the things that in Barlinnie was that a number of the prisoners, if they took part in the courses, were able to get, the level of SQs, sitting gills, bronze. A number had actually got employment out with the prison when they'd finished doing their courses. So I thought that was very well. Lots of outside agencies involved in rehabilitation. But I think it's the two main categories that are the ones that we should be targeting. Our resources.
Did employers come into the prison? Did employers come in
no,
at
there
all?
was Martin Plant Hire. They actually had employed a number of prisoners when they went through the process of, not what you call an apprenticeship, but they do work there as well, and various others. The bike shed was one where they would learn to, basically strip a bike down. People gave bikes, not some old, some not so old, and they would strip them down. They would completely renew them. And as they went through the courses, they got like bronze, silver, gold, and a number of these prisoners had actually got jobs outside as well. So I think, I was very impressed with what was going on. Perhaps if we could do it on a larger scale, it would be good.
But I think, Alison, you'd say we also had the bike shed at...
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes, yeah.
We don't know if they got jobs at the end of it. We didn't find that out, did we?
I think one person had been employed after they left at the bike shed. Yeah.
I go back now to Perth Prison. Roddy, you were at Perth Prison?
Yeah. I'll try and be brief because a lot of the points have already been covered, but I was impressed with the Governor and his staff, the Deputy Governor, with the general kind of attitude and enthusiasm for the prison. We visited a number of different activities. I think one of the things that disappointed me slightly was in the education unit there was what seemed to be a very good kitchen area and also an art room, neither of which were being used. And I think also when we were around, when we were in, I think the laundry room and indeed in the tailoring, again, the absence of staff meant that the number of prisoners who could actually be in there carrying out activities was restricted. Now that I've had the opportunity of looking at the figures, I can see that Perth doesn't actually figure very, very well on the scale of purposeful activity, we're below average. And I talked to a number of prisoners. I was impressed by the enthusiasm of a young man in the bike station, which was a relatively new activity in Perth. He was very enthusiastic, very keen about the project. One of from the bike station unit itself talked to me about the difficulties in trying to arrange employment. Obviously figures with what Alison's just been saying in terms of numbers. But what we saw was, I think, on the whole, quite good. It's kind of the difficulties in actually making maximum use of the facilities there. And obviously the same point about remand and short-term prisoners came across loud and clear, and I formed definitely the impression that there really wasn't any meaningful, purposeful activity going on for remand prisoners. When we looked at the B hall, which had been refurbished, we looked at the suicide cell, which wasn't actually being used. I wasn't over impressed by the condition of the B hall, and I did notice the following day, the day after my visit, a prisoner died on remand in Perth. So from that point of view, I'd say it wasn't necessarily about purposeful activity. wasn't terribly happy with. But through care was positive, I thought, in terms of going obviously beyond statutory through care, and there's obviously a project with Dundee at the moment, which is in its early days, but they certainly were, I think, doing better than average in terms of approach to through care for short-term prisoners.
Can I thank members for that? I'm going to, that finishes that particular item. I suspend very briefly to allow Colin McConnell to take his place, so we can now have questions from members with regard to our inquiry into purposeful activity in prisons. Thank you very much. Now, good morning, Mr McConnell. And we go to item 5, and we've had the opportunity, as I've trailed already, to hear what members had to say in their feedback from their visit. So, questions from members with regard to the subject matter, purposeful activity. Your starter for 10. John.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Mr McConnell. Targets can sometimes be a good thing. Do they impact positively, do you think, with regard to purposeful activity? I mean, the balance between quality and quantity, for instance.
I think the answer, in a sense, lies in the question. The targets are helpful because it gives us a focus and an impetus to make sure that both individually across the prisons, but collectively across the service, that there is a focus on making sure that we do as much as we can, and I think that's the issue, as much as we can, with the offenders who pass through our care. But I think as the question touches on, the target, as it's currently set, doesn't necessarily give us enough direction or enough underpinning focus on what the content should necessarily be, either specifically or generally. But the target is useful, and I think without it we'd be in a far worse place. But I think as the discussion is likely to go today, I think there's a number of different approaches I think we could take to make that target or a series of targets more relevant.
I didn't give you the chance to make an opening statement. I mean, do you want to make one, Mr. McConnell?
No, I think actually the discourse...
A man after my own heart. John, yes.
Thank you, Convener. Yep. I wonder, setting aside the issues which are very recur around all the establishments that we visited about remand and short-term prisoners and the challenges they put, is there a benefit in having individual personal targets?
I think undoubtedly that's the direction of travel. You know, as I say, having overarching targets for the organisation as part of a sort of building block approach across the 14 public sector prisons, I think is valuable and it's important. But really what needs to underpin that, and I think you're quite right in touching on the qualitative aspect, is what's important for each of the offenders that pass along that journey through custody. We've got some tools, as you know, and it was in the briefing, in terms of the core assessment and core plus, which is beginning to give us that level of granularity, that level of understanding. But I don't think the service, either through its systems or for that matter its ability to respond to that information, is necessarily at a mature stage yet in order to make best use of that information as it's gathered and made sense of.
Might be difficult for you to say. I don't think the public sector supports the Scottish Prison Service in a collaborative way with regard to some issues. You may be familiar with the getting it right for every child approach. Yes. Can we get it right for every prisoner?
I think that's, again, I've mentioned it before, that's one of those rifle shot questions, and if I can just put that into context. I mean, there's over 7,700 offenders in custody today, and whether the Scottish Government can invest sufficiently to absolutely address every single need or concern that those offenders have who pass into custody, as far as a prison service is concerned, I think is a real challenge for the government and for the people of Scotland. And I think the approach could be better developed if there was greater links between what happens within a national service such as ours and that which is happening locally, because ultimately it's where people come from and go back to that will make the difference. And there are initiatives underway. I mean, the Scottish Government, as you know, is driving an agenda of joined upness, and that's absolutely crucial. But there's a considerable journey yet to travel. It's underway, and if I may say so, I think one of the real positives here in Scotland, which I've not encountered anywhere else on my travels, is the connectivity of justice and education, justice and learning under Leslie Evans. And being in that forum as Chief Exec of the Scottish Prison Service has tremendous advantages in linking up with colleagues in education. And as you rightly say, I mean, the GIRFEC approach, not just translated into how we manage offenders, but particularly those youngsters who are in our care, is absolutely crucial. And we've got to make that work in custody, but connected with the communities.
Thanks very much indeed.
Are there examples, international examples, that the Scottish Government and indeed this committee could be looking at, where progress has been made in linking the national with the local in the way in which you suggest?
Not to, of course, downplay anything that colleagues or jurisdictions might have achieved or be achieving elsewhere. I'm not aware, certainly within these islands, of an approach that's any more sophisticated than ours. But what I will say, convener, if you don't mind, is that I think there's a uniqueness in Scotland in terms of the dialogue, which really is about joining up and joining together to make the whole system work. We're not at all taking a fragmented approach, which is an observation you could make of other jurisdictions.
Liam?
Thank you. I've got three areas that I wanted to ask you about. One, you've covered reasonably well with the earlier questions from John. But going back to this element of purposeful activity, where do you focus your pressure in the coming years to see purposeful activity to have a meaning in terms of particularly reoffending? Because presumably when you read the title purposeful activity, you get a kind of warm feel about it and think, well, that's good purposeful activity. But to what purpose? And presumably what we've worried about here in the committee is how do you prevent reoffending? And one would hope that this purposeful offending or purposeful activity would go some way to helping. Where do you see your pressure being placed in the coming years to encourage that?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I'll go right to the end and then explain why. I mean, ultimately, I think the Scottish Prison Service will become an organisation that's less distinct. I mean, currently we are pretty much a standalone organisation, and I think that's broadly recognised. We're an executive agency of the Scottish Government. But we are already on a significant journey to transform the organisation, to make it more connected, not just with justice, and I've just said with learning, and that will be hugely impactful. But we're on a really determined path to be connected with our partners both in the third and not-for-profit sectors, but also, crucially, at a local level. It simply won't work unless there's connectivity, evidenced connectivity with local authorities and how local authorities spend and support offenders, and look at those resources less distinctly. So as Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service, I sit in my 400 million and say, nobody can touch that. I think the approach has to be to look more broadly about the resources that are available and how to use them more impactfully. But just to put that in context, I think it's useful to think through the genesis of purposeful activity. And I suppose the Victorian era is still with us. I mean, the fundamental design of our prisons comes from the Victorian era, which was much more about reform or, for that matter, punishment, as opposed to what we're talking about today, rehabilitation, reintegration, desistance. So the design, the structure of our prisons and much of our paradigm construction is based still in that Victorian era. So we're pulling a lot of that forward with us. So actually the concept, I think, of purposeful activity has very much been the notion of the day to put positivism into what we do with offenders. But I think the intonation in your question is really important. Purposeful activity does have a sort of soft, unspecific feel to it. And you're absolutely right, because it is sort of unspecific. It's a very general approach, but really helpful and important. And I think, deliberately or not, you turned the question roundabout and talked about activity with purpose. And I think that's really what we've got to do. We've got to work harder to be clearer about what it is that or how it is that we have to work with offenders as they pass through our care that's going to be really meaningful and really impactful, rather than just triumphing that we've got 500,000 hours of purposeful activity that lacks actually the qualitative input that we need.
I mean, I think that, as I said, I was very impressed with the staff, but I had the suspicion that purposeful activity was actually occupying the day rather than having a point, an outcome. I wonder too, in connection with this, engaging prisoners with the ethos of this new life that you indicate would be a vision, should it be possible for court reports to take account of prisoners' commitment within the prison establishment in the event that they do reoffend in the future? So when it comes to that point where a prisoner is being sentenced at a future time on another matter, should the prisons be able to feed into a probation report that indicates from their experience whether or not within the prison a prisoner has actually shown some willingness to move forward or is unwilling to engage? I mean, I'm not conscious that anything comes from the prison who gets a really close look at somebody for a long period of time to report on paper to be included within considerations for the justice system.
I mean, I'll sort of constrain my reformist natural tendencies, I suppose, in answering that question. But there's lots of things happen to people when they're in custody. And of course, some are with us for either thankfully or depressingly a very short space of time. Others spend a significant proportion of their lives in our custody, and we do get to know them really well. But one of the, I think, realities of the system as it currently is, and it's not just in Scotland, it's elsewhere, is as that journey ends in custody, there's a drop-off. And all that knowledge and information doesn't necessarily go to waste, it stays with us. And then we make use of it as and when the offender comes back in. That said, again, I think credit where credit's due in Scotland. And something that has been achieved here is that every prisoner who leaves the Scottish Prison Service leaves with a community integration plan. So everybody goes out with some sort of plan. That said, the validity and the I suppose the value of that plan, of course, reduces the shorter the time that someone has been with us, because we've not had time to make the links or whatever it might be. But to take your point entirely, desistance is a journey. If you talk to Fergus McNeill or Shad Maruna in terms of desistance theory, we all understand that desistance is a journey, sometimes a long journey, and different things happen. And simply stopping offending is very rare. Behaviours change, and ultimately those who succeed desist. And I think it would be really useful if we were able to inform the judiciary as decisions are made about how far along that journey we think that individual might be, and the sorts of things that judges and sheriffs might want to take into account. Now, that's not to constrain, of course, judicial independence. That must be retained. But I think more information best placed would help good quality decisions.
And do you see that it's feasible that prisons would be capable in the foreseeable future to engage with that kind of supply of information to the system if the system desired it to happen?
I know there are some civil liberties issues associated with when someone has been given a sentence and spent their time in custody. That whole tracking and retaining contact is an issue. It's a civil liberties issue. I understand that. But I think there is, in a sense, for the common weal, there is a genuine case to at least offer, and in some cases, depending on risk, insist that that relationship is retained. And I'm sure you've heard me on already about the need to use the skills and knowledge that clearly exists within the prison service in terms of the men and women prison officers, who, in my view, are tremendously skilled and knowledgeable about offenders. Yet again, that's retained within the walls of the prison, and we need to find some way, again linking up with our community colleagues and our local authority colleagues, of using that knowledge and experience more widely to do the sort of thing that you're suggesting.
The last 2 points will combine into the one question. One's a quick answer about would you extend the curfew for TV across the prison estate to allow them to get to their beds so they can get up in the morning and feel okay? Leave that sticking to the wall, you can let me know. Second one is a hornet's nest for me. There was mention of the ability to do video conferencing from Lomos, but it still seems to be very constrained. There's a couple of issues there about the economics that lie behind it and the savings for the public purse. But as importantly, the disruption to prisons, constantly streaming people out in the morning to get them back in at night, and the time that's lost from the prison warders who could be doing constructive work with prisoners. Instead, they're shepherding people out the door, sometimes at 5:30 in the morning, to go hundreds of miles to a court, to hardly say a word, to be brought back to the same establishment. Is there going to be any visible commitment that we can see and measure that says we've actually got the point, we get it, and we begin to use the facilities that we've spent money on?
There's two issues there, and I would like to respond.
Short point. Graham's short points are quite long. It's a good point.
I can't help that. It's
you
too
can't help
important.
it. It gets paid by
I'll
the
respond
words.
to them both if I may. On the issue of video links with courts and video conferencing more generally. I mean, going back to my time in Northern Ireland, a very successful system works there, albeit the prison system's much smaller and so on and so forth. But many dispersed courts in very rural and local areas, and of course with probation offices just the same. So I've seen a system that can work and does work very, very well. As you know, we are pursuing an initiative to link up prisons and courts. And I think that initiative ultimately will develop into wider conferencing. If we're going to make the desistance journey work, then we've got to connect up. And IT infrastructure and video conferencing is certainly a key aspect of that. But we do have a cross-departmental initiative working on that. It's being piloted at Berlin and successful. And I think we are on a route to roll that out. if I may just comment on the telly one, because it is a bit of a thorny issue for me, because I'm actually a bit of a fan of TVs in cells, and I'd go much further. If I could be a wee bit reformist here, I would have telephones in cells as well. And let me explain why, if I may. And I know that might stick in the craw of certainly the public and maybe even some members sitting round the table here. It seems to me that you get people to generally behave normally if you treat them normally and you try and sort of recreate normality. If I may just use a very personal example, my son's in his second year at York, and he's studying law, so it's a hard course. And you know, I'm one of these grumpy dads that likes him to have his sleep and do his studies and all that sort of stuff. And just at the weekend there, I was texting him. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and I thought at that point he'd be settling down, get a good night's sleep, ready to start off on the Monday. Yeah. But actually what Victor said to me was he was heading over to his mates. They'd got their beers in. He was heading over to his mates to watch American football. Now, I subsequently got a text yesterday to say that by 2:30 they were knackered and they were off to bed. They gave up. But he had a full day of lectures after that, and I was a bit grumpy about it. But he's actually doing okay. But I use that sort of shaggy dog story to make the point that, you know, I watch telly probably not as much as I would like to, but sometimes to late on at night. I know lots of people that do. It's a window in the world. It's about keeping informed of what's going on. And actually, if it's displacement activity as well, if it stops somebody thinking horrible thoughts about themselves or others, it encourages discourse about, you know, Coronation Street or the news or whatever it might be. I think there's loads of positives come from that. Notwithstanding, I know it's one of those issues that polarise people, but I think there is a place for it. Whether it should have a curfew, I think there are pros and cons. I'd much rather treat people with respect and decency in the sense of please use it sensibly, and those that don't, well, we might have to curtail the activity for them.
Caveat that presumably it's monitored what they're watching on television, and obviously phone calls, if we just put that in the record so people don't think that, you know, they're in some kind of a Marriott hotel instead of in prison, you know.
I mean, one of the 9 factors that's generally accepted that help towards reducing reoffending, as we know, relationships, family contact. And I think anything reasonably and safely that we can do that can help sustain or develop family contact, we should give it a go.
Which I'm going to move on because you had a big whack at that, Graham. I've got Sandra, Alison, then Jenny. Sandra.
Thank you, and good morning. One of the interesting things I found about the visit, and I said that in my comments, was about obviously the employment, the amount of opportunities. I certainly seen in Berlin, but obviously it could have been better if we either have more monies or we do it in a more constructive way. And what I wanted to ask you was about improving the community links. I mean, I know we have long-term prisoners where I was very impressed by, I think it was a deputy governor said to me when I mentioned prisoners, and he said, you're falling into this trap where you think everyone who's in prison is a prisoner. We have bad guys and we have other people who just happen to, you know, have that turn in life and haven't been as lucky as others. I thought that was really, you know, not compassionate as such, but very, very common sense way to look at it. And they were talking about trying to improve the links with the community and obviously with the shorter term prisoners, etc. We know we have big problems. And one of their ideas that they came up with was the experience that prison officers have, as you have mentioned as well, and could they possibly be used out in the community where you have prisoners who obviously have served a short time. You don't want them to be a revolving door, and therefore they could go into community centres and not so much mentoring as such, but there would be a contact for them. And if they were able to, you know, get training and education within the community with the prison officers being their mentor or contact, they thought it could move on much quicker in that respect. So how do you see the links with the community and through education and jobs, and perhaps what was suggested by the Governor at Berlin as using prison officers, may they be retired with the experience of ever being able to go out into the community to be there for them?
I think the general approach should be that nothing in itself works, but lots of things together help. And I think we often talk about the what works agenda like it's some sort of fantastic, accurate science. And of course, because we're dealing with complex individuals in very difficult circumstances, actually that science is really difficult to apply. So a situation that is linked up with the environment into which the offender is going back into, and I know that term jars with people, but I think it's meaningful here, that the offender is going back to, is absolutely crucial. There is no point in having a false environment in prison, which is either everything in the garden rosy or totally depressing and not decent. We need to find a way of working together that ensures that that offender is looked after properly, but that the focus is on reintegration and resettlement back into the community. And with that offender with a far better, in a far better set of circumstances, not to reoffend than when he or she came to us in the first place. In terms of Berlini and what Derek McGill, the governor there, is doing, like most governors, I mean, Derek's a bit of an entrepreneur, and he's doing loads of things that are not directed by me or by SPS, but within the overall approach of connect locally, bring the community in order to engage offenders more generally in what's important outside and potentially how not to reoffend. But equally, the bit of that that's missing, I think, is the outreach, is the knowledge, the experience, the support going back out. I mean, as I said in the Sacro lecture in November last year, going straight's not an easy ask. And the academics tell us time and time again, as if by experience we didn't know, that desistance is a long and complex journey. And I think the best way to help people not to reoffend is to be there to catch them when they trip up. And maybe, and again I might be being controversial here, I think just sometimes we're just a bit trigger happy, where someone trips up, they're defaulted, they're back into the system, and the merry-go-round starts again. I think if we were able to connect with the community more broadly, then I think we might catch some people before they actually fall and keep them on the desistance path rather than back into the prison path.
How would you catch them before they fall? I mean, I hear you say, but probably you don't know until they do. So, then are you suggesting that if somebody defaults, it shouldn't be immediately, bearing in mind the independence of the judiciary, that there should be something else following on from what Graham was asking, which was that you have material that sheriffs can look at to see how that person was progressing in prison. I don't mean going soft, but just something that treats them more as an individual rather than if you do this, no matter who you are, you're back. Is that what you're suggesting?
I mean, primarily, the focus here would be on short-term offenders, and I heard much of the observations earlier, which quite rightly, in my view, focused on, in a sense, the lack of service provision for short-term offenders, and those are the ones that are on the merry-go-round. We all know that. But as I say, going straight, staying out of trouble is for some, or regrettably a lot, of offenders. It's a really difficult ask, and they've no immediate reference points when things are starting to go wrong, despite the best efforts of criminal justice social work or social work in general and other professionals who are out there. But I do think that SPS staff, prison officers, the men and women that work with offenders day in, day out, do have something to add in the community environment. And I see it as a 24/7 thing. Going straight's not 9 to 5. Things happen late at night or early in the morning or at weekends. And it could be a phone call that generates support, that generates advice, that makes a connection to another service, might just prevent that relapse back into the system and back into prison. Now, that sounds a bit utopian, I know, but if we don't make that journey and try it, then we'll never know. And I think there's potentially huge positives could come from that. Now, that's not to replace, let me say, that's not a land grab or tanks on lawn or whatever. I see it a bit like empowering and supporting and enabling the community, not replacing.
Gavin, I just want just a small part of that.
That was a Luke saying, do you have another question?
Yes. Well, basically, it was actually an example and where the conversation went from, this example of a prisoner who was out, and it's not just one, it happens to a lot of them, and put in the same environment, felt quite vulnerable but couldn't get joined up help, and then when they're in the house, the drug dealers who are in that environment put the drugs through the door. They don't ask for any money or anything, and then they appear 3 or 4 days later and the whole spiral starts again. And what you said is what I was trying to get at. Prison officers know all these things. They have that connection, and if there was some way that we could feed the two in together, perhaps we would stop a lot of the reoffending. And that was just an observation rather than a question.
Not a question, but I'll move on to Alison, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. You would have heard me earlier mention my surprise at just quite how many agencies and partners were working within the prison. And on one hand, I did see it as a positive thing because lots of experience being brought in. But I did feel that there was a disconnection and that I didn't get a real sense that there was an overarching ethos that was driving all of the different courses. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit more on how you hope to integrate the work that's being done.
I mean, in some ways, it's back to Mr. Finney's initial question. I think we focused on the general rather than the specific, important though that is. And I think that's been a journey for us. But this is a very crowded playing field, really crowded. And I think it's crowded because there is a genuine interest, there's a genuine determination, a hunger to make a difference. And that's generated lots of possibilities through voluntary agencies and the not-for-profit sector too. And actually yesterday, I won't, for the sake of this conversation, say which voluntary organisation it was, but I met with one of the voluntary organisations yesterday just to discuss that very point about how crowded the landscape is. I mean, specifically, if you look at Low Moss and their PSP, there are now 40 external agencies engaged through that PSP. Now, on one hand, the sheer colour of that is fantastic because there's lots of different and local...
P for the record.
Oh, sorry, it's public sector partnership.
Public sector partnership.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I didn't mean to catch you out. It's just that if anybody's reading it, they'll be like me going, what's a PSP? With all the jargon in the prisons that we went to, we need a glossary.
You can determine from my answer that I'm used to using the jargon without
yes.
deflecting back to what it actually means.
You won't be punished if you've got it wrong.
Thank you.
Okay? You'll be on probation.
So the point I was making was, I mean, in one hand, that's fantastic that there is so much local interest and generation of possibilities and help. But there's many of the organisations, in a sense, fighting for the same space. And how that translates into the prison environment, at times they're sort of jockeying each other for the same prisoner. And I think we need to be mature here and we need to be calm and have a discussion with colleagues out in the community about how we can make better sense of where the needs are and which organisations are best placed to meet those needs. I mean, there's a finite pot of money here if you look at that as a resource, and I'd like that to be spread as effectively and evenly as possible. But I think we've got to be careful for the 1,000 flowers blooming. In a sense, we won't see any particular beauty at all. And I think there needs, as I say, needs to be that calm, deliberate dialogue about trying to find out what it is we need to do and who's best placed to do it.
You have a timescale for that sort of review. I mean, do you clearly a significant piece of work?
Well, I think you know, Scottish Government's already generating that discussion through justice policy, And there are a number of initiatives that are being taken forward by Justice Policy, particularly on the Reducing Reoffending programme, that are designed to address that very issue. You'll know that a change fund has already been set up. I think there's 10 million in the change fund, and that's designed, I don't run it obviously, it's a policy issue, but that's designed to generate the change of direction, but make sure the infrastructure is put in place in order to support the policy intent. So there's every effort being made, and I think we're on the path to achieving that.
You note in your written response to us that you remind us just of the diversity of your prison population and the different groupings. So you've got women, you've got young people, you've got long-term, you've got remand. How do you make sure that the purposeful activity that's around actually meets everyone's needs and isn't too much of a one-size-fits-all?
Well, I think in truth, not everyone's needs are met, and I think in the current construct, it's simply not possible, and I wouldn't want to sit here and pretend that it is. I think our approach currently is we can identify those who are most needy, at most risk, and who either by dint of sentence length or by dint of their risk on release will be the main focus of our attention. To make sure that they get the broad range of services targeted at the right time in order to meet those needs. Other than that, I think more generally, we try and do the very best we can and, again, going back to Mr Finney's question, provide the most that we can. Now, that's well intended, but I think we have to recognise that it's probably lacking in ultimate impact and effect, but it's well intended.
Crowded landscape. I mean, we've known this for a long time, that a lot of well-meaning voluntary sector and public sector in, and they are competing. They're a bit precious, some of them, about my one's working as opponents. So is it in the chain of command, is it your requirement that governors have a good look at, review at this, how it's operating within the prison, then you have a look at it? I'm just looking at how is it all, I mean, it's happening all over the place. So how is it control is taken of this in some way and accountability? Is it the governor that then has to then report to you so that you can see that, in fact, you know, this is happening elsewhere? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think as a service we've had a distinct approach. There isn't a policy position that says this is how to go and do it, and these are the organisations that are badged as acceptable or whatever.
Didn't mean that. I'm not asking you. I'm just asking you that where you see so many voluntary sector within it, you know, I know the governor, for instance, at Pullman is now looking at it all, how it integrates. So how do you, as head of the SPS, then see that the prisons throughout, governors are doing that?
It's organic. I mean, it's exactly that. The governors have pretty much freedom currently within their own situation to determine which partners they work with and which ones they don't. Now that has some real strengths because of local connectivity, but it also has that real risk of just diffusion and lack of focus on the actual issues. Now I would like to be on a journey, and I think this is where we're going, to give that local flexibility to determine what makes the best local connections, but actually have some, if you like, distillation mechanism that helps the governor or the organisation to identify which organisations in which circumstances are likely to provide the best resource.
And are you that distillation mechanism?
No, I wouldn't be. I think that probably sits with policy colleagues in justice.
Right, that's just what I was trying to get at, so that we filter them out a bit. Jenny, followed by Roderick.
Thanks, Convener. Mr McConnell, we recently, a few weeks ago, looked at a diagram of community justice authorities, and I think the Audit Committee are looking at how effective these organisations are. And I think one of the things that struck us when we took evidence on it is there are so many partners round the table that some actions seem to be falling between partners or through the cracks. And I was particularly struck in your answer to my colleague Graham Pearson's question when you were talking about education and partnership working is so important, because prisoners, at whatever point they leave prison, are going back to their local communities, and you must work in partnership, and I completely understand and appreciate that. But it's also a time at which local authorities are experiencing really, really harsh cuts to their budgets. I've had recently a problem in Dundee with Perth Prison trying to match up a simple issue about homelessness lists to cut down on abandonment of properties, and trying to get the prison to speak to the council on that. And it strikes me that I would be surprised if local authorities are really in a position to put resources, especially with the political pressures locally, to put resources into a responsibility which isn't theirs, rehabilitation of prisoners and the education system. And in that context, is there not more of an imperative on your service to deliver rehabilitation? You've got a captive audience while these people are within your care, to deliver skills, whether that's physical or intellectual, within the prisons, and then the skills that will be transferable anyway when they go back to the community, and perhaps not wait for a very integrated partnership approach to come together.
Well, the answer to that is twofold: yes and no. But I'll start with the yes, if you don't mind.
I like your style. He's right.
You're absolutely right to, in a sense, put me in the spot. Scottish Prison Service is allocated a tremendous resource from the Scottish Government, and the government and the public at large should have high expectations of what we do with that money. But I go back to a point I made earlier, which is primarily the system that still underpins what we're doing is the Victorian system, which is keep people in custody safely, decently. And if you look at the Audit Scotland report, which I know you have, it's identified there in terms of the 4 Rs, that about 3/4 of our resource is spent on restriction. That's keeping people in custody safely, decently, making sure that they can get to all the activities safely and decently. And as I set out for you in the letter of introduction in response to the convener's invitation, we mustn't view, because it isn't the case, that offenders are a homogeneous group. They are not. It's a tremendously complex environment. And whilst I accept the challenge that says we must do what we can to transform people, and that's the business we're in the human transformation business, it's an incredible ask of the committee or the government, of the public, to expect the Scottish Prison Service, or for that matter any prison service, to transform every single individual that passes through our care in every set of circumstances. I don't think the Scottish economy could afford that, and even if it could, I doubt ultimately that I could produce the evidence to say that in every case it's worked. And I go back to the point about nothing in itself works, but lots of things help. So, for example, over 50% of the education resource currently delivered in the Scottish Prison Service deals with numeracy and literacy. Now that gives an insight into where the population is at, and towards 60% of the offenders who are in our care would struggle to compete with the average 14-year-old in terms of numeracy and literacy. So our focus is very much at building people's capacity to cope, and not just in terms of the education environment. 70 to 80% of offenders who come into custody self-declare alcohol and drugs addictions problem, much of that associated with their offending. So I'm beginning to set out for you the scale of the challenge that we face. Now, not that we are trying to distance ourselves from it, but the concept, the idea, the SPS is either funded in such a way that it can meet everybody's needs on every occasion, and can do that on its own, I think is probably not sustainable. I think how we can do more and do better is by making the links with other professions, and particularly the local communities that people come from and go to. And I'm not at all, for the sake of clarity, I'm not at all saying that local authorities should sub-fund the Scottish Prison Service. I think what we need to be clearer about is what the expectations for and of a custodial service such as ours is, and what the responsibilities for those people who are on a journey for and of their communities is, and how we bring those two elements together. And it's looking at the whole resource, not looking at the resources separately.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answer. I mean, I do appreciate it. It is a massive challenge, and I wasn't suggesting you completely go out on your own and deliver this. Of course, partners have got to come in and work together. I think the point I was hoping to make is that I think there's a balance between becoming bogged down in a massive array of network of things where actually action then doesn't happen and things aren't delivered. I mean, I was in Perth Prison a few months ago and was particularly struck, and I think Rod alluded to this in his summary of Perth, that there wasn't nearly enough purposeful activity going on. And as I went round the area of the prison that had these classrooms or areas in them, a lot of them were closed and were in darkness, and this was Friday afternoon before lock-up time, just at 4:30, which seemed very early. And I wondered also if, in response to that, if you might be able to tell us if Perth perhaps has a worse rate of purposeful activity than other prisons in the country, and perhaps if anything's been done to address that.
I think, again, there are probably two ways that I should, or two elements to the answer. I think there are some, firstly, I think there are some real dangers in trying to make sort of monochrome comparisons between the number of hours that a given prison generates in terms of purposeful activity. Because I think what needs to happen there is to be put in context of how old the prison is, what its fundamental design is, the mix of offenders that prison cares for. So at one end, just I think to put context in, the top performer is likely to be, I think on the evidence I have, Low Moss. And there are reasons for that. It's modern, it's designed with that in mind, and so on and so forth. The older Victorian prisons, Perth, Berlin, Edinburgh has been revamped, but you get the picture, where that was never actually part of the concept. The governors and staff there faced tremendous obstacles just to make the daily routine work. You know, buildings that aren't connected, long routes to work or to education. Perth would be part of that difficult group. So I would urge the committee against, as I say, making two sort of single judgments on numbers and look more at, in a sense, the degree of difficulty. So as far as Perth's concerned, I think the governor and his team at Perth actually do a good job in an environment where the infrastructure itself is not necessarily designed as efficiently and effectively as it could be if you compare it to somewhere like Low Moss or even Addywell, which again is a reasonably new prison where the connections are far more easy to make. But I think the second element I'd ask you to consider, going back to the community links, is looking beyond, in a sense, what prisons in themselves can do. And I think we're beginning to explore the boundaries, really, of what prisons can do on their own. And the Scottish Prison Service has been pretty good at that. But I think the next major development, if you like, the next major leap forward, is to open the service up, to have in-reach and outreach of a completely different scale, which will really connect the communities with the offenders and the offenders to the communities that they're going back to. And if we can make more use of the resource that's available more flexibly across that journey, I think we could make a far greater impact than hence too we've been able to.
I'm just conscious of time, and I know members have got the chamber this afternoon. Roddy, you've not been in.
Yeah.
Alison, is this a fresh line of questioning?
Follow up from Jenny.
I'll tell you what I was considering to the committee. I'm going to let you in, Rod, because you've not been in, is because there's lots of questions I might want to ask. I'm looking at the schedule for, and subject to availability, is that we have on the 19th of February, we've penciled in evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on this issue, and it might be useful to have Mr McConnell, the Cabinet Secretary, back because other issues will have arisen. I don't want to suppress it, but I feel if we get Rod in and then we've got a panel session on the 5th of February, possibly 2 panels on the same thing, and then we have the Cabinet Secretary, Mr McConnell, and would that be satisfactory? Because I know there's lots of questions following on that we might still want to ask. Is that all right? Conscious of time. So I'll take you, Roddy, and you'll be last.
Before I ask my question, I just wanted to comment briefly on following on from what Jenny Mara was saying about Perth Prison. The figures are disappointing. I think my major concern when I was going around there was the feeling that if a member of staff was off sick or on holiday, then the facilities were automatically closed down. I wonder if there were ways that we could actually look at that, so perhaps bringing people elsewhere to cover holiday times. Sickness is obviously much more difficult, but I felt that there was an underutilisation of facilities because of that point.
It would be silly of me to disagree with you. I think you're absolutely right, and again, it's back to the fundamental construct of the operation of the service, where this sort of rehabilitative. The growth, the reintegrative aspect of what we do does not have the same level of funding or protection as the restrictive, the keeping in custody, keeping safe does. And that's undoubtedly something that we need to think more deeply about as we move ahead. Yeah.
2 other real points of clarification, really. You talk in your written submission about the National Directory of Interventions and Services, and using that to be more to use through care more effectively. Could you give me some idea what this national directory looks like? Are we just talking of a kind of a volume of a book, or why is it so important?
It's essentially what it does, and it's been a government initiative. Justice Policy owns it. It's a directory of all the interventions or services that are available to offenders, whether they are in custody or in the community. And the concept is, which I think is a good one, is to make sure that all the agencies, all the organisations, all the professionals out there who are working with offenders know what services are available and who's delivering them, so how to access them. I think there are aspects of not having to recreate the wheel, although perhaps we've touched on maybe there's some of that going on. But it really is about saying these are the things that are out there and we believe have some positive impact on the offender journey. This is who's doing them, this is where to go and access them.
Who's responsible for keeping it up to date and preparing it?
Justice Policy.
Justice Policy. And the second smaller question, the community integration plan, who sees that at the end of the day? I mean, it's obviously a big thing for a prisoner coming up, but who's got access to the community integration plan?
Yeah, for statutory offenders, and obviously it's community, the criminal justice social workers, the community side of offender management, if you like, who form the link. For the non-statutory offenders, we do try and make similar links, but the offender, where we can, the family, and where we can, the rest of the community-based justice system are involved in that. But it doesn't, I have to say, it doesn't always work as seamlessly as with the statutory offence group. And of course, as I said earlier on in the discussion, the shorter the time that the offenders are with us, then the less valuable that integration plan is. And it's one of those issues about you know, what's time well spent, but others will have views on that.
Okay, thank you.
This is not questions for answering, but a couple of things that have not been raised is if you could actually advise us of the impact, we've asked about the impact of the earnings policy on purposeful activities, so it would be useful to know the SPS's earnings policy for prisoners. And secondly, it might be useful to have an anonymised model of a community integration plan. I don't know if they find that quite useful in the committee to see actually what it looks like for a prisoner coming out. One that's non-statutory perhaps would be useful, and one statutory.
I'll write to you with...
That'd be very helpful. Now, thank you very much for your evidence. I do hope you'll be available on the, what did I say? 19th of February, perhaps, to come back, and it would be very useful then. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll suspend very briefly, and we now move into, well, we don't need to, because we're moving into private session.